Welcome back, everyone. Here in this section, we will discuss feed tags and some of the information that's included on a feed tag, as well as some of the information that may not be found on a feed tag. We have information like the purpose for the feed, to how it's supposed to be utilized, the guaranteed analysis, ingredients, feeding directions, and manufacturing location, as well as a caution statement that may be listed on some feeds and may not be listed on other feeds. All of this information is provided on our feed tag, and we're going to break down what each one of these different components means and how it should be utilized. For that feed. Some information that you may find in this area is information on, is the feed medicated? How is the feed supposed to be utilized in a brief way? Is it a supplement? Is it a complete feed? Gives you an idea of the purpose for that feed. And what class of animals is it meant for? More detailed instructions will be provided in the feeding directions section, which we'll get to in just a minute. I also want to note that in the feed purpose, you'll sometimes note or see that the feed is medicated. And what does it mean if the feed is medicated, and how do we know how we can use that? Well, this all goes back to the Veterinary Feed Directive, and some of our feeds are regulated under the Veterinary Feed Directive, and some of them are not. The Veterinary Feed Directive went into effect January 1st of 2017, and it put many of the antibiotics that we use in feed and water under veterinary oversight. Some of the antibiotics include chlorotetracycline, erythromycin, as well as tylosin. So what does all this mean? Well, we need a prescription to be able to feed a feed that contains one of these antibiotics. Well, how do I get a prescription for a medicated feed? I have to have a veterinary client-patient relationship, or a VCPR. So you need an established relationship with the veterinarian where they understand your operation, they understand your animals, and have sufficient knowledge to be able to diagnose disease and provide a recommendation in terms of treatments through antibiotics for some disease problem that you're currently experiencing or likely to experience. So we can no longer feed medicated feeds solely for the purpose of growth promotion. Under the Veterinary Feed Directive, that is no longer allowed. We can only feed medicated feeds for the treatment of disease, and all that has to be regulated and controlled through a veterinarian. And so we need to have that relationship established so that when we do need to provide those antibiotics, we can work with the veterinarian to obtain a prescription, obtain a VFD, and so to be able to take that to the feed mill, to be able to have them manufacture a medicated feed for us and be able to sell that to us. So something to keep in mind, and kind of an extra step in terms of purchasing medicated feed now, but something that when we think about development of antibiotic resistant bacteria and things like that, we need to be cautious of, and that's why all of this went into effect. So be mindful of if the feed is medicated or not. Be mindful if you need a prescription in order to purchase that feed. When we talk about coccidiostats, most of our coccidiostats are not regulated under the Veterinary Feed Directive. So we can feed a feed that has a coccidiostat in it, and we don't necessarily need to have a Veterinary Feed Directive to be able to do that. But if we are going to feed a feed that has one of these antibiotics listed here, then we do need to make sure we have a prescription in order to get that. So the next thing on the list is the guaranteed analysis. And you'll see here, and in our example, these values are not necessarily exact. They're sometimes minimums, maximums, but what they do tell us is that we know there's going to be at least this much protein, or maximum of this much fiber, at least this much of this mineral or that mineral. And so it gives us an approximation, it gives something to work with. And Using protein as an example here, it says minimum crude protein is 16%. Well, the feed could have 17 or 18% protein, but we know that it has at least 16. So it gives us something to work with, and if it has extra, that's all the better. That's just extra on top of what we were already expecting. What do these different components mean? Crude protein is simply a measure of the nitrogen content in the feed. When we think about ruminant animals and measuring protein content in their feeds, we typically express this in terms of crude protein. Nitrogen is one of the components of protein, and so we can use the nitrogen content in the feed to be able to predict how much protein is there. And so we use crude protein as our measurement of protein. We have crude fat, which is our measurement of fat content. We have crude fiber, which is a broad measure of poorly digestible carbohydrates. And so it's going to give us an idea of the fibrous content of that feed. We have acid detergent fiber, which is a measure of feed digestibility. So how well the feed will be digested, how available is it? And then we have our calcium and phosphorus ratio. And calcium and phosphorus ratio, if you think back to some of the feeding sections, the nutrition sections of this course, it's very important that calcium phosphorus ratio is critical for the prevention of urinary calculi. And so we need at least 2 to 1, 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus in order to minimize the development of urinary calculi. So we can check that on our feed tag as well. Next up is the ingredient list, and the ingredients are included in terms of its greatest to least inclusion rate. So the first ingredient you see will have the highest inclusion rate in that feed. The last ingredient you see will have the lowest, the least, the smallest inclusion rate in that feed. Oftentimes these will be somewhat vague. And the reason for that is it gives the feed mill flexibility in adjusting what actual ingredients are included so that they can formulate it in the lowest cost, the least cost formulation. So you see here, it just says processed grain byproducts. Well, there's a few options they could utilize that fit into that category based on feed costs and availability. They can tweak those things. The guaranteed analysis is going to stay the same, but they can adjust those different components to make sure they're processing, they're producing, manufacturing the feed for the lowest cost possible. And so that's why you'll see a lot of times these somewhat vague descriptions used in the ingredients section. Some of the components are listed very specifically, and others might be more vague. We can read this ingredient list and we can understand some of the components in that feed, and that can help us understand which feeds might be better for us to feed compared to others. And one of the things we're going to look for is the inclusion of ammonium chloride, especially in our rations for growing lambs and kids. Ammonium chloride is also utilized for the prevention of urinary calculi. So not only do we want the right calcium phosphorus ratio, we also want some ammonium chloride included. Both of those are going to work together in a preventative way and make sure that we don't have urinary calculi issues. So check the ingredient list to make sure ammonium chloride is included, especially for those lamb and kid rations. Feeding directions, and this is a very critical step. And if you read anything, this is the one you should read, because this tells you how you should actually feed the feed and follow these feeding directions. Oftentimes people ignore these feeding directions, or they try to tweak it in their own way. And that's not how the feed was meant to be fed. And we need to be really careful that we feed the feed, how it's formulated and how it was manufactured, how it was meant to be fed, so that we can make sure that we're meeting the nutritional requirements of the animal. As well as if it's a medicated feed, we want to make sure we're getting the right dosages into those animals so that medication is actually effective. So failure to follow those directions can result in a lack of performance, so that we might expect those animals to grow a certain amount. And if we don't follow the feeding directions on that feed, that animal might not perform as well as we were expecting it to. And it might not be because the feed is bad, it might just be because we're not following the directions and feeding it how it was meant to be fed. From an animal health perspective, when we go back to the medication, if I have a coccidiostat in my feed and I'm not feeding it to labeled directions, then I may not be getting enough of that coccidiostat into the animal every day to be effective in preventing the development of coccidiosis. And so if I'm underfeeding a supplement, I could run into coccidia problems, even though it is a medicated feed, because the dosage is too low and I'm not feeding the proper amount to achieve the required dosage. So we need to be very cautious of this, and when in doubt, come back to the feeding directions and feed it how it was meant to be fed. At the bottom, you'll find the manufacturing location and the company that manufactured the feed. I like to glance at this and see, where did that feed come from? How far did it travel to get to my farm? Was it a substantial different distance? How long ago was it fixed? If you can find out, when it was processed, when it was manufactured, that's important in terms of, especially our vitamins. Our vitamins, a lot of them will break down with time, especially when exposed to heat. And so during the summer months, if we've got a feed that was manufactured some time ago and has been stored for a long period of time or shipped over a long period of time, so a lot of those vitamins may have broken down. And so we may need to provide some vitamin supplementation in addition to the feed that we're feeding, if that is the case. So just be aware of how long it's been stored. The fresher the feed, the better. But depending where we're getting that feed from, it might take a little bit longer to get our hands on it. So be aware of that to know what some shortfalls might be. And then the last thing you might find is the caution or warning statement. And this is related to animal health, and it's going to include information either about withdrawal times. So if it's a medicated feed, if it's got an antibiotic in it, it may say, there might be a 7-day withdrawal or a 14-day withdrawal where, if we're going to feed that feed, those animals have to be off the feed and on a different feed for that period of time before they can be harvested, before they can be slaughtered. And so we certainly want to be mindful of withdrawal times if we're feeding medicated feeds, and make sure that we don't violate any of those. And so be aware of that and look for those, any statement regarding withdrawal times. Also look for any statements regarding toxicity concerns. And so, some of our feeds contain ingredients that are toxic to other species or toxic if overfed, for example. And so we want to be mindful of that. If we buy a goat feed, that their copper levels might be too high, we might not be able to feed that feed to sheep. Some of our medicated feeds for small ruminants, we can't feed to horses. So be mindful of those things, read that caution statement, and make sure, especially if you have multiple species on your farm, make sure there's no crossover, make sure they're being fed how they're supposed to be fed. So there's a couple examples here. The first feed tag here is this 34 lamb supplement. So right in the title, it says that it's a supplement. It is medicated. Here in the feed purpose, it says how it's meant to be used. So it's for growing, finishing lambs and ewes. The medication is included for the prevention of coccidiosis, these Eimeria species. It has our active drug ingredient, the lacilocid. It includes the concentration that is included in the ration as well. So we have a medicated supplement feed here. The guaranteed analysis is 34% protein, so that we know it's quite high in terms of protein content, but again, it's a supplement. It's supposed to be a protein supplement where we're going to mix this high protein feed with something else to dilute down that protein, maybe mix it at 14 or 16%. We've got our other ingredients that are listed here. This does include vitamin A, D, and E. A, D, and E are our essential vitamins, and so it's good that those are included, especially if we're going to be feeding animals in confinement. It's good to make sure we have those essential vitamins included in that supplement. We have a warning statement here. This feed should only be used only in accordance with directions on this label. Feed to ruminants only, so no horses here. And then we have our ingredient list. Again, the feed ingredients are somewhat vague. We do have ammonium chloride that is included in this feed as well. Another example, this would be an organics feed. So it says organic in the title. It's a complete feed for sheep. We have our guaranteed analysis listed here, our ingredient list, and then we have our directions for use. So you'll see here, even though it says, up here, the feed purpose, like I said, it can be somewhat vague. It's a very broad descriptor up here. We want to make sure we come down here to our feeding directions and note how this feed is actually intended to be utilized. This specific feed is something for sheep to be utilized as a supplement with good quality forage. So we want to make sure that we have some good quality forage included in the ration. We're not feeding this as the sole component of the ration. Consumption of this organic sheep feed should be fed at a minimum rate of 1.5 pounds per 100 pounds for all growing and finishing lambs. And then for our lactating ewes and our breeding rams, they should receive a minimum of 2 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. And then has a note when changing feed rates, transition slowly. It also has our labels down here. So this is a certified organic product. Also, you can see the other labels that are associated with this feed. And then lastly, we have a goat feed example here. So it's a supplement feed for growing and mature goats. So really all classes of goats here. Our guaranteed analysis, this would be a 16% protein feed. It's got some of our vitamins and minerals listed as well. It's got our ingredient list. And then it has our feeding directions. And here it's got the feeding directions, again, broken out by the class of animal. We have our milking does, yearling and dry does, our breeding bucks. It has this important statement here where it says provide free choice access to good forage, whether it be hay or pasture, water and salt to all animals. So it's noting that, again, this is not meant to be the sole feed in their ration. We need to include a high quality forage source with it. We need to include some salt, and we need to make sure they always have access to some palatable water, a palatable water source. So make sure you read these feeding directions and follow them closely. This does have a caution statement. Do not feed to sheep. It is a goat feed. It includes higher levels of copper that could be toxic to sheep. And so we want to make sure this is fed to goats only. It also has a note, do not permit intake of supplemental selenium to exceed 0.3 parts per million in the total ration. So this feed, along with anything else they may be consuming, we want to make sure that we're not exceeding 0.3 parts per million, because again, we could run into toxicity concerns. This feed also notes that it's a texturized feed. So we have pelleted and texturized feeds. Pelleted, obviously that feed has been, all the components have been put together in a single pellet. We also have texturized feeds where each component is individually, available in that feed. Some animals prefer texture, some prefer pelleted. Pelleted feeds are generally a more consistent feed source because every bite is exactly the same. Textured feeds, the animals could potentially sort out certain ingredients from others. But again, something to note, you want to make sure if you want to feed a pelleted feed, you can look at that feed tag and tell, is it pelleted or is it not? In the same way, if you want to feed a texturized feed, you can look for that as well. So what is some information that is missing on our feed tag? There's some nutritional values that are relatively important that aren't found on the feed tag. And these largely are related to our energy values. And energy, if we think about our pasture-based, forage-based production system, energy is often the limiting nutrient in our animals' diets. And yet it's not included in our feed tag. So we need to be mindful of that. Total digestible nutrients is kind of our overarching metric for energy content in our feeds. And so that TDN value is not found on the feed tag. So we don't know what that is. We can estimate it with the equation here where we take 80 and we subtract the percent crude fiber. That crude fiber number is found on the feed tag, so we could predict what the TDN value is. We also don't know energy values, our net energy values, so whether that be the net energy for maintenance, net energy for growth, or net energy for lactation. So if we want to get more specific in how we're balancing and formulating rations, we don't have those net energy values to utilize either. And sometimes the concentrations of our vitamins and minerals are also not listed. Some of them may be listed, some of them may not be listed. So we need to be mindful of that. So what do? We can ask the feed mill for a more detailed feed analysis. And they may or may not give it to us. It may be proprietary. They might not be able to provide that to us, but they may be able to. And so it's at least worth asking. And you can ask them, especially for these energy values, if they have those available, and be able to utilize that if you're looking to better understand what you're feeding. But when in doubt, just feed the feed according to labeled directions. Remember that those directions were formulated, they're written in a way to make sure those animals meet their nutrient requirements. And so just feed them according to labeled directions. There may be some vague components on that feed tag, but if we follow the directions, we know those animals should be meeting their nutrient requirements, as well as meeting the dosage requirements for any medication that may be included. Problems can arise when we don't feed those feeds according to labeled instructions. The calcium phosphorus ratio become off. Remember, we want 2 to 1. And if I start mixing other things into a already formulated feed, I could mess up that calcium phosphorus ratio and then run into urinary calculations. The concentration of ammonium chloride is also very important. And again, if we start diluting out a feed, we might not get as much ammonium chloride as what we need. And the same is true for our coccidiostats and our other medicated feeds. So in summary, our feed tags provide a lot of important information for proper feeding management and making sure that our animals meet their nutritional requirements. There may be some missing information like those energy values that we need to be mindful of and aware of. And we can ask the feed mill for more specifics on that particular feed, but we may or may not be able to obtain that information. But when in doubt, if you don't know, just feed the feed to labeled directions, labeled instructions, and that will ensure that those animals are meeting their nutritional requirements, as well as meeting their requirements, dosage requirements for medications that may be included in that feed. So keep these things in mind. The feed tag can be a very useful piece of information. Make sure you read through and review that feed tag on any feeds you're interested in purchasing or any feeds that you plan on feeding. And that will ensure that you're feeding them properly and those animals are getting the nutrients that they need. We'd like to thank the sponsors again, and that completes this section of the program.